I'm prepared to be disappointed. That's what I was prepared to do.
Before we stand, I would like to thank Buck Lattimore for covering for me for the last few weeks. And today is Friday the 13th, so I'm not telling any jokes. Phil told me to stay away from that today. However, there is a bit of trivia. Can anybody tell me what comic character made its debut on January 13th? I will just give you a hint. They live in a castle in Florida. You're right, April is right, it is Mickey Mouse, 1930. So it is so very good to see each of you. I'm happy that you are here today, and if you would please stand for our defining statement. Kiwanis is a global organization, volunteers dedicated to improving the world, one child, one community at a time. Yes, Kiwanis is a great organization, and we need you, and kids need Kiwanis, so thank you. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, for the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Clay, would you lead us in song today?
In your book, on page 18, Song 39, Battle Hymn of the Republic. This was a special request. And we will start, about mine, okay. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He has loosed the faithful lightning, his terrible sword. His truth is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Clay. June, will you share with us our invocation today?
This is great. Let us pray. Let us take a moment to offer thanks and blessings for one another and the opportunity to serve our community through our club. Let us be a source of hope for those in need, especially the children in our communities, and guide us to be the best we can and to make a true difference in the lives of children. Let love, kindness, giving, and support be reflected in our actions. We offer prayers also for our members in need and ask that special care be provided to them. Amen.
Thank you, June. We want to welcome all of our guests today. And we also want to welcome everyone that is joining us online. So it's good to see we have a good group in both places. Before we do our introductions of guests, we would like to do our membership welfare, and I think Francis is going to lead us in that.
Yes, and so have news that Randy Hartley, they've discovered another tumor on his left side, and he will have surgery, but he's progressing. His prognosis is good, and the recovery period is 6 to 8 weeks. So if y'all will keep Randy Hartley in your thoughts and prayers. And then the birthdays are up. And so coming up, we have Harold Gardner, and Elle Poole just celebrated a birthday. Or no, it's today. Holy cow, Elle.
Elle, happy birthday.
I knew I'd seen him. Does anyone else have anything they'd like to share from membership welfare?
Oh, and Marshall has a birthday. Marshall Looney.
Marshall Malney.
Malney.
Yeah. Is Marshall here? I know Elle's here.
So, Elle, we're going to give you a big birthday wish and not sing happy birthday, okay?
We'll grant you that wish.
Yeah.
Anybody else for membership welfare? Okay, well, we're very happy to be together again today.
Thank you, Francis. Thank you. We'll move right into announcements. And your board met last night, and we approved Jason Tyler He is sponsored by Jefferson Griffin, and his introduction will be in the upcoming week, next week. We also, your board is seeing a rise in food costs as well as other costs. We are watching those very closely with our budget. We also have the upcoming KPI pending increase in dues, and so we are always going to be looking for ways to mitigate those costs. Greeters, I think we have one greeter for next week, Mike Dodd. Would anybody else be willing to greet with Mike next week? Just need to see one hand come up with Mike. Okay, Sandra, thank you. So Mike and Sandra will be our greeters next week. If anybody is interested, I think Phil Kirk is doing the following week. Please let us know so we can get your name on the list. I do want to remind you to check your weekly emails and updates for upcoming activities. I hope you all noticed that we had a wonderful newsletter that came out the first week in January. So thank Courtney Allen for doing that. Courtney is looking for those who are willing to help with content and other parts of that. Just let her know. Serving at the Salvation Army on the fourth Friday of each month. So we have volunteers have filled up the slots for January. We are looking for those who are willing to serve on February 24th. If you're willing to do that, we can sign up online, or you can let Cricket, Courtney, or myself know after the meeting. And there's some important dates coming up, so I want you to take note. First is Charter Night. Charter Night's going to be April the 28th. It will be at the University Club. More information to come. We also want you to save the date for our spring social. That will be June 22nd, and that is a game at the Durham Bull. That will be at the Durham Bulls ballpark. So keep your eyes posted for updated information on the game night. And now I'd like to ask Buck to come forward and introduce our speaker. Oh,
Yes.
I did forget the guest. So Courtney's going to lead us with the guest while Buck's coming this way.
Okay, Brody Burwell has a guest.
I'd like to introduce Joanne Harville, who works with us at Envisage Law. She went to law school in Tennessee and worked in Michigan and has experience in state and federal courts.
Thank you. Welcome, Joanne.
If my two girls would rise. I brought, for moral support,
Okay.
my wife Jill and my daughter Allison Hilton from Boston.
Welcome.
Gwen Bass.
Today, I have John Stevenson as my guest. John is the Internal Audit Director at Wake County. John grew up in Raleigh and is still here, and we worked together for a short period of time. Please welcome John.
And I am honored and humbled to be able to introduce the next three guests. I will start with Bill Burlington. Bill Burlington is joining us. He is recently retired. He worked with many folks in this room and knows a few, so we hope he is looking for our club to join. So come back again. Welcome, Bill. And Bob Lippert. Bob and I go to church together, and I invited him today, and this is his third visit, so we're hoping that he may be interested, but welcome, Bob. And then I'm going to introduce you to my better half, and that is Roger Askew. He is Wake County Attorney, and I'm super happy he's here, and I don't know where his application is. I'm going to let someone else handle that one.
Well, thank all of you, and today for our speaker, we have one of our own members. And let me tell you, this member is a native of Raleigh, and he joined this Kiwanis Club in 1967. And I don't want to embarrass him, but I was a rising sophomore in college at that time. And see what it's done to me. He looks younger than I do. I don't understand this at all. But Henry's been a member of our club for 56 years. Let's give him a round of applause for that. Henry Barnett is an undergraduate degree from Duke University. He got his law degree at Wake Forest. He was a trial judge in this county for 32 years, 14 years on the district court and 18 years on the Superior Court. And today in retirement, he is a self-styled historian. So to present to us information on the impeachment of Andrew Johnson, welcome Henry Barnett.
Good afternoon. I'm so young that I have to have that rail to get up here. So thank you for that, Buck. I told Buck that I was actually an amateur historian, an amateur. Now what that means is, first, I love history. The word amateur comes from amo, which is the Latin word for love. So I love history. Second, I'm not a professional. And third, I read a lot. Now, it's been announced that I'm going to talk about the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. I plan to do that, but the impeachment of Andrew Johnson really deals with a much larger subject. The impeachment of Andrew Johnson was actually an incident in the Reconstruction, from especially right after the Civil War, the first 5 years. And the impeachment trial was a very important incident, but it was an incident in a bigger picture. Now, who was Andrew Johnson? Those of you who are from Raleigh know, and most of you, and maybe those who are not from Raleigh know, that Andrew Johnson was born in Raleigh in 1808. He was 6 weeks older than Abraham Lincoln. So I figured that would be the last of December of 1808. That is when I don't have the precise date he was born. But you know, you probably all seen his birthplace. It's really an overgrown dollhouse. I don't know how anybody lived in that. When I was growing up, it was in Pullen Park. Now it's been moved to Mordecai Park off of Wake Forest Road. Originally, I understand that it was probably where the Justice Building is, or right off of Capitol Square, probably close to Fayetteville Street on Morgan Street, in that area. That's where it originally was. Andrew Johnson left Raleigh one other thing I want to say about that is, you remember the bronze statues that face New Bern Avenue of the presidents who were born in North Carolina? Andrew Jackson, James K. Polk, and Andrew Johnson. But all three of them made their mark in Tennessee. Johnson left North Carolina probably when he was about 14. And when he was 16, he ended up in Greenville, Tennessee. And he was self-educated. He was a tailor. And it was said of him that he was the best dressed president we've ever had because he made his own clothes. He got into politics. He was an Andrew Jackson Democrat. He worked his way up, and in Tennessee, he was elected to Congress. He served a couple of terms there. He became governor of Tennessee. Then the legislature of Tennessee elected him to the United States Senate. You notice I said the legislature elected him. Under the Constitution, United States senators were not popularly elected. That did not occur until 1913, when the 17th Amendment was passed. The original Constitution, and all during this period of time, provided that senators, United States senators would be elected for 6-year terms by the state legislatures. Okay, when states started seceding and when Tennessee seceded from the Union, Johnson was opposed. He was a Unionist all the way. Johnson hated Jefferson Davis and he loved Abraham Lincoln. it wasn't too long that Tennessee became really the first state that the Union armies captured, or they mostly captured it. And I would say that began with the Battle of Shiloh and General Ulysses Grant's victory there. But it spread, and about 3/4 of the state was under Union control. And everywhere the Union Army was, the slaves were freed. Andrew Johnson courted the formerly enslaved people in Tennessee. He referred to himself as the white Moses who will lead you to the promised land. Well, Lincoln appointed him military governor of Tennessee in 1862. Now, the first question that everybody's going to ask is, why would Lincoln put him on the ticket in 1864? Lincoln was up for re-election in 1864, and he was worried about getting beat. Politics. That's the reason that he put him on the ticket. What he did was he dumped his present Vice President, Hamilton, who was a good Republican from Maine. He dumped him. He can be one of the footnotes to history. Who was Lincoln's first vice president? Who cares? But anyway, here was the situation that made it such a difficult thing for Lincoln. He thought he was going to lose. In the summer of 1864, he thought he was going to lose. You have to understand that the Civil War was unpopular, even in the North. It started out as a war to preserve the Union. On January the 1st, 1863, Lincoln came out with the Emancipation Proclamation that freed all the slaves everywhere. So from then on, the war was about freeing the slaves as well. And what is the thing about an unpopular war that makes it even more unpopular? Lack of success. Remember Vietnam? Lack of success. And at that time, the Union armies were in Grant was commander of the Army of the Potomac, the Union Army in Virginia. He was up against Robert E. Lee, and that was a stalemate. No progress. They weren't losing, but they were not making progress. Also, the Democrats had nominated General George B. McClellan, who'd formerly been the commander of the Army of the Potomac. He could not deal with Lee. Lee beat him just about at every turn. So Lincoln fired him. McClellan didn't like Lincoln to begin with. You can imagine how he felt about him after he was fired. Well, also, the Democrats were running on a platform of stop the war. Okay, so Lincoln talked the Republican National Convention in allowing him to put Andrew Jackson on the ticket as a vice president. Now, they could not run as a Republican Party. So what they created was something called the National Union Party. So that's the party that ran against the Democrats, not the Republican Party, the National Union Party. Okay, by the time elections were held, everything had changed. Grant got his second win and had pushed Lee all the way back to the gates of Richmond, the Confederate capital. Lee was pretty much surrounded at that point. Also, in the West, General William T. Sherman had moved out of Tennessee. He had taken Atlanta, and he was ready to march to the sea, splitting the Confederacy in two. In other words, in November 1864, they knew they were going to win. So naturally, what happened is they were elected in a landslide. So on March the 3rd, 1865, Lincoln was inaugurated for a second term, and Andrew Johnson was vice president. Well, soon thereafter, Congress passed the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery. And it was not ratified until after Lincoln was assassinated. Lincoln is assassinated, Johnson becomes president, and the 13th Amendment is ratified. Now, the Confederate States didn't get an opportunity to vote on this. It was all, they were not in the Union yet, so it was just the states that were in the Union at that time. Incidentally enough, there was one Confederate state probably had around that period of time joined the Union. They'd done what was required of them. Tennessee. Tennessee was the first state that I know of that rejoined the Union. Okay, here's the thing. What was the problem between Johnson and Congress? This was a Republican Congress, but they all weren't radicals, but the radicals were the most influential, and it was their agenda that was carried out. The leader of the radical Republicans in Congress, Senator Ben Wade of Ohio, Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, and in the House, Representative Thaddeus Stevens of Tennessee. They were the leaders of the Republicans, and the Republicans really controlled the agenda. And really what this was, just look at the picture. Here you have 4 million freed slaves, most of them destitute, poor. They had no homes. How could they be acclimated into a white society? That was the problem. There was also the problem of how do you get the former Confederate states back into the Union? Well, Johnson, his number one priority was get the former Confederate states back in the Union. In fact, Johnson was under the opinion that they had never left. He said, in effect, all we have to do is that they swear allegiance to the Union and accept the 13th Amendment, and they're in. Congress wanted much more than that. And there's the rub. Congress was looking at it from the standpoint is we've got to look after these enslaved, former enslaved people. We got to look after them. And that was more important than the Confederate States rejoining the Union. In fact, as far as many members of Congress, the leaders of the Confederacy, civil and military, were traitors. Well, I mean, you could see this. You could see this clash coming. Well, the thing about it is, we don't know what Lincoln would have done for Reconstruction. That's just a guess. But Lincoln kind of felt like he wanted to preserve the Union too. Remember, in his last, the second inaugural address, and this is about the only thing I can say about how Lincoln might have felt about that. Beyond that, it's all a guess as to what he would have done. But remember what he said: with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, let us strive on to finish the work we're in, to bind the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, and do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. I think one big difference between Lincoln dealing with, I'll say this about Lincoln too. Lincoln didn't always get along, Congress didn't always get along with Lincoln, even during the war. They had an enormous amount of respect for the man. They liked him. But their big problem with Lincoln was he was too cautious. Johnson was another matter. Johnson was a drunken, arrogant, stubborn individual, and he was about as racist as could be when it really came down to it. And it was his way or the highway. Lincoln was not that way. In other words, you could talk to Lincoln. They knew that. They could talk to Lincoln. They couldn't talk to Johnson. Then as far as Reconstruction bills that were passed, every one of them, Johnson vetoed. But they had the majority. They could override his veto easily, and they did it. Some of these Reconstruction bills, one of them was, there's a white terrorist activity like the Ku Klux Klan was rampant in the South. So the Union Army had to stay in the South to keep order and protect the formerly enslaved people down there, 4 million. And they divided the South up into 9 military districts. Okay. Then they created the Freedmen's Bureau, which was a good thing. The first commissioner of the Freedmen's Bureau was Major General Howard, Oliver Otis Howard. He was known as the Christian General. He lost his arm at Gettysburg, but he was the first commissioner of the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau was really a social welfare group or organization that was designed to help the formerly enslaved become acclimated to American society. That was the purpose of it. But what it also did was it created many historically Black universities and colleges. I think probably, I'm not sure about this, but Shaw University, St. Augustine were fathered by the Freedmen's Bureau. I know for a fact that Howard University was in Washington, D.C., the Black Harvard, and it was named for General Howard. He was their first president. Well, Johnson, even though he originally had appointed Howard to be the commissioner of the Freedmen's Bureau, he didn't like the job he was doing, and he fired him. Now, why did he fire him? Because he was doing his job. That's why he fired him. But that's the way Johnson was. So all of this was going on. Total lack of cooperation. So Congress says, we got to get rid of this guy. How do we do it? So now they look at the Constitution, and for the first time, they discovered kind of the impeachment clauses. You can impeach the president or the vice president if they are convicted of treason, bribery, or high crimes and misdemeanors. They couldn't get him on treason or bribery. What about high crimes and misdemeanors? What does that mean? I don't even think we even know what that means now. It's kind of like what former Justice of the Supreme Court, Potter Stewart, said in a concurrent opinion in an obscenity case in the 1960s. He said, I can't define obscenity, but I know it when I see it. And so I think that's kind of the way they looked at high crimes and misdemeanors. They did conclude one thing. In order to get him, he's got to be guilty of a crime. What kind of crime can we get him convicted of? All right. Johnson had inherited his entire cabinet from Lincoln. He didn't like them and they didn't like him. But one in particular was a sore, was a real sore. And that was the Attorney General, Edwin Stanton. And Congress knew that he was going to fire Edwin Stanton. He hated him. And I don't know about the others, but he was going to fire Edwin Stanton, his Attorney General. So they passed a law called the Tenure of Office Act. The Tenure of Office Act basically provided that the president could not fire a cabinet member, or really actually any person that had to be approved by the Senate. But a cabinet member is what we were really talking about, without Congress's approval. Clearly unconstitutional. In fact, 20 years later, the next Democratic president, Grover Cleveland, got that before the United States Supreme Court, and the United States Supreme Court said, yeah, that's unconstitutional. But it clearly was. But they also made it a crime. It was a crime to violate that, was a crime punishable by fine and imprisonment. This is the President of the United States. Okay. Johnson took the bait. He fired Stanton. Stanton said, I won't go. He barricaded himself in his office. And he said, you're going to have to get me out, oust me. And of course, he was being supported. I mean, all of Washington, not just Congress, but all of Washington was giving him food, whatever he needed. Go to it, Edwin, go to it. That was the attitude at that particular time. But anyway, what was Johnson going to do? I want to get rid of this man. He even appointed a successor, which the Senate quickly rejected. He called on General Grant. He said, Grant, as the chief military officer in this country, I want you to go in there and remove him. Grant wouldn't do it. The official reason he wouldn't do it was he thought that probably if he did it, he would be aiding and abetting violation of the Tenure of Office Act. But the real reason was he was a friend of Stanton. And it didn't happen. Okay. So, okay, we've got him now. That's the way Congress looked at it. We've got him. So, and you know, in impeachment proceedings, it starts in the House. The House draws up the articles of impeachment. Then it's sent to the Senate, and the Senate acts as a jury. The Senate is the one who decides whether he's guilty or not. Well, the House created 11 articles of impeachment. 9 of them had to do with the Tenure of Office Act. The other 2 were things like they accused Johnson of slandering Congress. Wow. And I mean, like, that's never happened. But the second one, another one, was that he would not enforce the Reconstruction law. He was negligent in his duty in that he refused to enforce the Reconstruction Acts. That's not unusual either. He was the executive. It's up to him as to how he's going to do that. So you see the problem, you see the legal problem, but then there's the political situation. This is what they did, and they brought it to the Senate. They had a trial, and it was a major trial. It was all of the United States was sitting there waiting to see what would happen. The galleries of the Senate were packed. as they had the trial. And 2 months, it took 2 months. I don't know why it took 2 months. I mean, he had clearly violated every one of those. And they're putting on their evidence and everything. Why it took 2 months, but it took 2 months. And then it was time for the Senate to vote. Oh, I want to say one other thing about that. It also provides that if the president or the vice president is subject to impeachment, the trial is presided over by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. In this case, it was Salmon P. Chase. He was a Republican, a strong Republican. He had been the Secretary of the Treasury in Lincoln's first term. And if you want to pull out your $10,000 bill, his picture's on it. But it is. I mean, I don't work for the Federal Reserve or anything like that, so I've never seen one. And I don't know about any of you either. But anyway, he presided over. But during the course of the trial, even though he recognized that this was a bad president, he said, "There's something wrong with this." I mean, they could tell by his reactions that he didn't like what he was doing. Well, then it comes to a vote, and it takes 2/3 to convict him. Okay? Congress said, doing the arithmetic, we've got him. There were only 9 Democrats in the Senate at the time, 54 in the Senate, 9 Democrats, 45 Republicans. They had to get 36. The final vote was 35-19, 1 vote short. So the 9 Democrats voted no, but 10 Republicans, moderate Republicans, voted no. One senator from Iowa, James Grimes, said that he realized, he said that Johnson is a bad president and he shouldn't be president and all that. However, he said what Congress had done in impeaching him was unconstitutional. They had overreached. So that's why he voted no. But that's it. Well, Johnson finished out his term about 1.5 years, and he was about the lamest of a lame duck at that particular point in time. In 1869, the Republicans nominated General Grant. General Grant was elected in a landslide, and he became the new president. Actually, Johnson actually tried to get the Democratic nomination, and the Democrats said, "We don't want you." So he treks back off to Tennessee, and he's referred to then as Tennessee Johnson. And I think they was called Tennessee Johnson was kind of a pejorative, kind of mocking him. Well, he did. In 1874, the Senate did elect him to the United States Senate. They did, and so he goes back to Washington for 1 year and dies. Now that's the story of Andrew Johnson. Now there are a couple of takeaways from this, and one would be, if Johnson had been convicted, who would have been president? Today, it's the Speaker of the House in that situation. See, there's no vice president. The vice president is now the president. Actually, it'd be the president pro tem, at that time, the president pro tem of the Senate, who was Ben Wade. Well, a problem there was occurring was the Democrats had taken over the legislature of Ohio, and Wade's term was up, and he was about to be ousted as a United States senator. So I don't know. So that's one thing. The second thing is, could Johnson have appealed that to the United States Supreme Court? There is no provision in the Constitution for that. However, I would say this, There's no provision in the Constitution for judicial review either. And yet, Chief Justice John Marshall created it in Marbury versus Madison in 1804. So I don't know. I mean, those are two things. I think, to me, I think it's highly likely that would have happened. It would the Supreme Court would have taken it. I think Chase, as Chief Justice sitting in the trial, would have thought that. And that's why he was so nervous about it. Well, the big thing, though, is Reconstruction, Civil War. The 1860s was definitely the most dangerous decade that we have ever had in our existence. There's no question about that. A civil war where we almost lost our country, a bloody civil war. Then a Reconstruction that was hotly contested as to what to do. And you need to this is hard for us to understand. But in 1860s, 60 to 70% of the white population were white supremacists. And that's not the South. I'm not including the South. That is the North. That is the way it was back then. I mean, that is tough to sit back in these days and times and think about that. Those were the times. And there's been nothing like it, and it was all because of slavery. Slavery was the cause of it all, and it shouldn't have happened, but it did. And I think we are certainly having the legacy of that even today. And I think everybody agrees with that the legacy of slavery still exists. Where they disagree is how deep is that legacy and what to do about it. Okay.
Are there any questions?
Yes.
You said Andrew Johnson was living in Tennessee when he became vice president?
Yes.
But Tennessee had seceded, right?
Yes, but you didn't have to be a citizen.
Oh, really?
Actually, I mean, it was pretty much under federal control. I mean, he could pick. There's nothing that says that a president, as to where a vice president or a president has to live. They have to live in the United States. Of course, he was not living, as you're right. He was living in a Confederate state at the time, but it still happened. That's all I can say about that. You know, nobody challenged it.
We were talking last week about the.
What's that?
We were talking last week about the birthplace of Andrew Johnson here in Raleigh, and that it was up on Fayetteville Street. And it actually, I looked into it, it actually moved 4 times. They moved it from Fayetteville Street to East Martin Street, and then in the 20th century, early 20th century, they did take it over to Pullen Park, and they put it over there near the railroad tracks, and it became, they said it became the home of too many hobos and winos. And so they had to move it off the railroad track side and put it over a different part of Pullen Park. So, and then in the 1930s, they refurbed it and closed it for the World War II and then reopened it. And that's kind of how that house has moved around. So it actually moved 4 times. When it went to Mordecai, it was the 4th time. But I was looking also when Johnson came back to Raleigh in 1866 or 7, he was still the president, but he came back here to for the dedication of a monument in the city cemetery to his father. And the newspapers said that there was several newspapers in Raleigh at the time. One of them said there were large crowds, and the other one, Holden's newspaper, said he was appalled because he said the crowds were cool toward Johnson. Of course, Johnson was not the most favored person in the South, but anyway, I thought that was interesting. The house moved around 4 times and to where it is now. And Johnson did come back to Raleigh on a couple of occasions, but that was the last time.
I just remembered it Pullen Park and then later at Mordecai. I don't remember. I'm not old. I'm pretty old, but I'm not that old to know where it was before that.
Even though slavery was abolished, there was a passage of many statutes that resulted in the incarceration of former slaves over very minor things. And then, while they're incarcerated, their former owners could go post bail and take them and literally work them to death. Is my understanding. Isn't that true?
I didn't get all of that.
There's a post-Civil War.
Yeah.
I don't know if it happened in the North, but I understand in the South, there were many laws passed that made loitering or walking on the street or wearing your hat wrong a misdemeanor that resulted in former slaves being put in jail. And then their former owners were allowed to go bail them out and factually and in practice own them at that point. The people were supposed to work off their bail, and that never happened.
That very well could be true. I mean, I really don't know about all that.
Well, you were talking about the effect of slavery, and even today, and my understanding is that it continued as in fact, slavery, even though it was abolished.
Well, it was tough on the white population from their standpoint, not to
they had to go to work,
not to have workers anymore.
Yeah, they had to go to work.
I mean, they had to deal with that. So that could be one way, hire them back, and I'm sure they did hire some of them back.
Well, they didn't pay them anything though.
They paid them,
not much,
but not all of them.
You mentioned earlier, Henry, that 70% of the population, even in the North, were probably white supremacist. I was in New York City at the library up there, and they had an exhibit of the number of people who voted for the 13th Amendment. Remember, the South didn't vote for on that.
Right.
There were over 100 votes against the 13th Amendment in the House of Representatives. I think 140 votes in the House of Representatives. So even the 13th Amendment that eliminated slavery, that you went 4 years to fighting over that there was a good portion of the elected population that voted against it. And the other interesting thing, there were 4 states. The Emancipation Proclamation did not end slavery everywhere. It only ended it in the states that seceded. So there were 4 states in the Union that after January 1st, 1963, still had slaves, including Delaware and Maryland, and I think Kentucky and Tennessee.
Delaware, Kentucky, Missouri, and Maryland.
There you go. So they were,
But the
Delaware.
Emancipation Proclamation included abolition everywhere. In 1861, it only applied to the Confederate states who they went to war with. It didn't apply to those 4 states who were slave states, but was still in the Union. But in January the 1st, 1863, it applied everywhere.
I have a quick question. Great job, by the way. Darity and a co-author at Duke have written a book about reparations and what it would actually equate to. My question to you is this. I don't know if you can really equate this, but the economic impact or advantage that America has, having had slavery as an institution, seems to have put America in a lot of ways far in advance of other countries around the world. Do you think that is accurate or inaccurate?
No, I don't, because I think it includes what happened in the North, the industrialization in the North and things like that, certainly contributed to American wealth and that type of thing. I'm sure it had its effect, but I would not say that it was a major impact. Now, I just don't agree with that.
Okay, let's give a big round.
Thank you. Thank you.
Will you sign this book?
Sure.
So we have a book that we give, I will yell over your shoulder, forgive me. We have a book that we donate on behalf of, to the Feed the.
Just sign it right there.
Right here.
Oh, okay.
Right there, and you'll sign it for us, and we'll
Okay.
get it to the school system.
All right.
So thank you.
Thank you, Stacy.
Perfect. And I want us to remember Dr. Rich Bono is speaking January 20th. He is the Associate Dean and Director of NC State University and over the Extension Program.
Okay, there you go.
And thank you.
Thank
Great
you.
presentation as always.
Thank
We
you.
enjoy
Thank
having you. Want to thank our guests for coming and invite you please to come back. Joanne, Jill, Allison, John, Bill, and Bob, and Roger, please come back. It's a great community. We'd love to have you a part of it. And with that, we will adjourn this meeting. Have a great week, and I look forward to seeing you next week.